Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet, which is in a state of perpetual turbulence and interlinked challenges. It seems for years now. I'm sure there have been other periods in history when people had this feeling, but it just seems on steroids these days. We have turmoil, again, geopolitical, both through Putin and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have climate change. We have the pandemic, which is ebbed largely, but I just got over my first case in 1,350 days since the pandemic evolved. So the pathogens are us, and there's a rhetorical storms all around us. And pressures on scientists have never been greater because they're right in the middle of the thick of things these days in ways that wasn't always the case. There have been issues like eugenics and other periods when science and public values and public perceptions got all tangled together. But again, it seems more consequential than ever, which is why I pulled together this conversation. This Sustain What episode is on a really interesting concept that has emerged in recent years and really crystallized in a new paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by 38 or so authors, everyone from Steven Pinker to people who we all should know as well as him, but who are emerging scholars and scientists. And the question is, what's happening when science sort of censors itself? This can be at the level of an individual choosing not to put forward certain data, or of the way publications choose the papers that they publish or don't publish. It gets all amplified by the media, people like me, because the media have their own narratives and their own filters for what we think the public needs to know. I was at the New York Times for 20 years in different capacities and saw this, up close and personal when scientific or technical findings were not going along with what what the world seemed to think they should be showing us. And just so I'm really glad to have on two the lead authors of this particular paper, and also they're also authors of I'm still here. My camera is weird. They're authors of a couple of essays, commentaries that are get going into more depth. Musa al-Gharbi, who's at Stony Brook University. We'll learn more about him in a minute. And Cory Clark at the University of Pennsylvania is a psychologist and has other things going on that I want to learn more about, including this Center for kind of clashing. How do you get people to overcome their clashing views and work together? Whoops, hold on. Let's see if I get my camera. Oh, I'm back. I'm on the other.
I think your microphone also, the quality of the sound has
Oh, isn't that
down.
nice?
On my end, anyway.
Oh, it probably did. Technical issues. Give me 1 second and let's see if I can fix that.
It sounds better now, so
Maybe
I don't know
better.
if you just did something.
Well, there's no magical producer back here on the other end of this. Let's go back to here. Okay, let's see. Come on, camera. Come on, technology. Get with it. So I just want to start right in with this this paper and ask you both, Cory, first, I think, what drew you to this really interesting question? It's kind of a subtle one, and people think of censorship typically as something different. Okay, so what do you? What drew you to this question? And we'll talk about summarizing it briefly too.
I think really just years of observation of academia and what's been happening. A lot of controversies that have been happening when certain papers get published, and then there's public backlash to those papers. And some of the most prominent journals, a lot of the journals in the Nature Springer family of journals, have been adding these criteria that do seem new regarding the idea is that the editors of these journals and even the reviewers should be commenting not only on the quality of the science, but also what are the potential downstream consequences of disseminating these findings with the world, and can they potentially be harmful? And is it worth publishing the science given the potential consequences of that information? So that's really what's inspired my interest, is just being in academia and seeing what's been happening, and how since I first started really noticing the problem in around 2012, things have just seemed to escalate that whole entire period up until now, in terms of this becoming a bigger issue and a bigger conflict in science and among scientists.
Were there like, what were there core emblematic examples that come to mind?
I think there was more like a series of events. Like, I think at first we were sort of talking about the potential for liberal bias in science. And that was at first, I think, being considered in terms of like, are we holding certain papers to higher standards, which could be a type of censorship. But then it got to the point where it's like, well, are we obstructing certain conclusions from hitting the literature in the first place? Then like there have been other things like, retractions have been up. FIRE has documented increasing cases of scholars being targeted for their scholarship, getting fired, getting their talks canceled and things like that. So all of this has been increasing, even more so just in the past, I think, around 3 years.
Yeah, and then throw in a pandemic or two, and
people are a little restless.
As a journalist in the early days there, and of course this came in the social science literature around race and everything else around the same time. I just was talking with a colleague, James Temple, at Technology Review, and one case that came to mind for him was the lab leak hypothesis. In the beginning, was treated as an absolute, had to be a conspiracy. Come on, and now it's a much more fluid, complex reality. No one can cross either of those things off. So, Musa,
well, and in fact, there was this interesting case that was covered by Nate Silver on his Substack, Silver Bulletin, where he talked about an example where some of the scientists who co-authored a paper, a big prominent paper that was supposed to definitively debunk the prospect of a lab leak hypothesis, privately in their own emails that came out as a result of Freedom of Information Act requests, they understood the prospect of a lab leak to be a lot more plausible than it was. But in the paper that they published, they portrayed it to be completely impossible. And in part of the reason why there was this difference between their personal judgments and the image they portrayed to the public is that and this came through in their emails, is that they were deeply concerned that by talking about the potential of a lab leak, they might be empowering in some sense empowering Donald Trump to make kind of adverse xenophobic statements or policies. And so in their efforts to avoid enabling what they thought was a bad actor or leading to potential ramifications for US-China relations or negative perceptions towards Chinese people or towards China in general, they systematically suppressed information that they believed in order to present a distorted picture of the world. So actually, this is a perfect case of the kind of dynamic that we're talking about in the paper.
Right. And you don't make you know, in the paper you lay out, you're calling for more research. You're also saying that trying to weigh and gauge this phenomenon is really hard. So finding better sources of data and better ways to get at it is important. You're not making a judgment in the paper that prosocial activity is all bad or all good. I think is it fair to say that too?
Yeah, I think a lot of members of our co-author team we all have different beliefs about whether we should ever be censoring science, and if so, what is the threshold? What evidence has to be forward in order to justify suppressing science? Which I think is why what we could agree upon as a group was, well, at minimum, we all know we need better information, because we honestly don't even know what the downstream consequences of even some of the controversial findings that people are calling for suppressing today. Are they actually harmful? And even if so, does suppressing that science create better outcomes overall?
Right. And let's get at sort of the flavors of this, because as I said earlier, I'm going to get back to that core definition, which I think is very valuable. Let me just show it here on screen again. Sorry, my voice is a little thatchy, but it's just the way it is these days. Yeah, the definition at the paper is actions aimed at obstructing particular scientific ideas from reaching an audience for reasons other than low scientific quality. So there's a lot there, right? This is, do you have your own mental list for how, you know, as we were saying earlier, how does this, what's the range of activities that encompasses? Maybe Cory and then Musa.
It's a huge range of activities. So something as simple as a person thinking, oh, this would be an interesting question to ask, but better not, because heaven forbid I find the wrong thing and then I pay a really high social price, things like that. Really very pro-social things like encouraging a grad student not to study a topic because you're afraid this will prevent them from being able to get a job, to editors deciding just on their own that they don't want to publish a paper, even if they think it's as high a quality paper as anything in their journal. And then, of course, it can be, you know, even more authoritarian than that, like if the government gets involved. But that's not really what we're looking at here. Here, we're looking at scientists either censoring themselves or censoring their peers because they find the findings to be socially costly or you know, potentially harmful to human groups. But yeah, maybe Musa has a different idea.
Yeah, so in Inside Higher Ed, myself and then one of the other co-authors on the paper, Nicole Barbaro, just published an essay talking about some of the complexity with studying censorship, because fundamentally what you're doing is you're measuring an absence, right? Right. You're trying to document statements that were never made, papers that were never published, debates that never took place. And there are some ways that, you know, social scientists have identified to kind of get at this question, but it's complicated. And part of the reason it's complicated as well is because there are a number of cases where people perceive themselves to be censored, where censorship isn't actually taking place. So, for instance, if you publish low quality work and you get criticism for that work, that's not censorship. Your work was published, right. and the kind of feedback is appropriate, unless, of course, people who are dissatisfied with your findings are trying to actually get you punished for your work, which would be a censorious activity, right? In other cases, people publish work and it gets ignored. It doesn't get the kind of attention that they feel it deserves, and so they describe that as a type of censorship. But again, censorship hasn't taken place. The work is published. And so there are these kinds of dissemination biases that do occur under certain circumstances. So for instance, as you've noted, media organizations often focus on studies that advance certain narratives and ignore findings that don't go the way that they'd like to. And that's like adjacent to censorship in some important way, but it's not quite, it's not censorship. And so part of the, and then lastly, I'll say, even with respect to self-censorship, there's this kind of important distinction between people who hold their tongue because of reasonable concern for consequences that they will plausibly face if they, you know, say the thing that they're afraid of saying or publish the thing, versus unreasonable fear or careerism from people who are unwilling to take even like mild risks in pursuit of telling the truth, right? So people who are that kind of cowardice is not like a cultural problem from outside institutions. That's a problem of the individual who's choosing not to tell the truth when they actually could, and without like serious repercussions, right? And so it's important to, you know, draw these distinctions. And that really complicates the studying censorship.
And what's been the reaction so far? Did you drop a pebble into the public stream, or is it a boulder, or what are you hearing?
I've heard different things from, I guess I'm assuming the left and the right. On the right, more people. So on the right, at least among academics who are, say, like more center left, which makes them right relative to other scientists, they are a little bit miffed with the prosocial motives frame, I think, because they find the consequences of censorship to be really catastrophic for science and the pursuit of truth in science. And so to give it this, well, the intentions are good frame is maybe a little bit annoying. On the other side, I think you see people wanting to say, well, what you're talking about isn't censorship. Doing ethically responsible science isn't censorship. It's the way science works. Science isn't just publish anything, who cares who we hurt. It's, you know, publish information that's helpful for human flourishing. So those would be like the two main criticisms I think I've seen. But the upside of that is I think that means that people on both the left and right have read the paper, or at least some of them, because they know a little bit about what we're saying. So that's potentially a positive sign.
So how do you go about identifying sources of data or a way to identify the absence? Again, this is the tricky part. It reminds me a little bit of the multi-decade debate on whether the ivory-billed woodpecker is extinct or not. I've written about that science a lot, and actually it has some of this prosocial aspect to it, because some of the folks who are fighting to convince people that it still exists are doing so because that would then lay out a regulatory landscape around that part of the southern United States that protects not just the possibility of that bird, but protects the ecosystem. So but it's really hard to prove the absence of something. And so what does that look like, the research component here? Maybe Musa and then Cory. Oh, sorry, Musa. I think I had you muted for a second because there was a bit of feedback. Okay.
Yeah. So I do. So Nicole and I talk about this in the IHE and the Inside Higher Ed piece, and we talk about this a bit in the paper too. So there are a few different types of data that you can look at to try to evaluate the existence of censorship or self-censorship. So for instance, you can do audit study. One common way of testing for censorship is to conduct audit studies. So scholars will take identical papers, but change things that shouldn't matter, like the author's name, so signaling male or female, or one race or another, things like this, things that shouldn't matter. Will change their name or their institutional affiliation, or change the direction of the findings, because in principle, it shouldn't matter if the findings go one way or another, if the method is sound and the theoretical stuff is sound. So they'll do audit studies where they submit the same paper and see if they get systematically different results depending on factors that should be extraneous from the purposes of scientific judgment. There are organizations like FIRE or PEN America that track attempts to silence or punish scholars alongside institutional rules and state policies that restrict freedom of inquiry. There are sort of behavioral measures, so polls and surveys asking, and alongside the behavioral measures, there are like polls and surveys where you can like ask scholars about their experiences with censorship and self-censorship. And then there are also statistical tests that you can do to evaluate publication bias. So whether or not we're seeing papers that are tilting a specific way because certain views or certain findings are systematically excluded from publication. So those are some of the sort of most common ways that scholars test for the presence of censorship or self-censorship in the literature. Maybe Cory has some additional ones.
No, those are all great ideas. I mean, it is just a hard problem, and almost certainly we're not aware of a lot of cases of censorship. A lot of the ones that we would become aware of are the ones that the censorship like mostly failed because it becomes public knowledge and then people are aware of the content of whatever was censored. But there's certain other, like one thing we see, for example, in terms of supporting the idea that harm concerns are often the driver of censorship, is that certain views are systematically more likely to be self-censored. So people who feel like they have socially controversial opinions report higher self-censorship than people who think they have socially acceptable empirical beliefs. And then we also see, for example, women are often more censorious of information. And I don't think it's that women are, more authoritarian. It's that women have greater harm concerns and are more desirous of protecting people and groups that they perceive as vulnerable. So when it comes to science that they perceive as having potential to harm people, women are more likely to say, this information shouldn't be getting out. So looking for patterns in what is talked about and what isn't talked about can kind of indicate where is the controversy, what's getting suppressed.
Is there something that universities can do, that, not just in the literature, but I think we just so far been talking mainly about the paper, the publication process. What about the other parts of academia? I think, this has been a very fraught arena recently on several fronts, and gets more and more fraught as other issues explode into the public consciousness. Maybe this is a good time to talk about your adversarial research project too. What can be done in academia more broadly that might help get directionality here away from a perceived, do we wait for the firm evidence to emerge from quantitative research on literature, or do we already know pretty clearly what are some dynamics that can shift the game?
Yeah, so I see the Adversarial Collaboration Project as related in some sense. So essentially, adversarial collaborations are just the idea that when scholars disagree with another scholar, the very first thing they should do is go work with that person and try to resolve their disagreement. The way I think that can help is that right now, sometimes there's a sort of guilt by association fear that if I work with this person who disagrees with mainstream views, then I myself will become ostracized as well. So it's viewed as costly to work with people. But if this is framed in terms of like, well, we have this really helpful methodological procedure, which is working with people you disagree with, and this produces better science, then that might reduce some of the stigma surrounding working with people who have published views that are considered, to be contradicting mainstream desires or perspectives in their discipline. But I think there are other things universities could do. Like, for example, if, the leadership in the university, people higher up, made it clear that they were going to defend their faculty members if the mob comes for them, then they might feel freer to pursue whatever interests them, even if it's potentially controversial. I don't think many faculty feel like they can fully trust the universities they work for to stand up for them if that moment came. And then potentially also, the way they respond when there are student protests against speakers. If the universities had a firmer stance, we're like, your concerns are valid, you're free to express those concerns. However, we uphold free speech here, and the speaker is allowed to speak. If universities had firmer positions on those, or rather appeared to their faculty members as like being consistent in their applications of those principles, then I think they might feel a little bit more secure in pursuing various topics and sharing their empirical beliefs more freely.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. And I was going to say, so in the Chronicle piece, Cory and I talk about, and in the paper itself, Cory and I talk about, and our co-authors talk about some of the ways that journals could change their policies that could make censorship easier to detect and less desirous to do. But there are also things that individual scholars can do in the meantime, and maybe actually incentive structures in terms of how we evaluate faculty. So for instance, one thing that faculty who are concerned about censorship of science can do is more service work. So if you're someone who's concerned about other people censoring scientists and you want to make sure that different views are aired in journals and things like this, then when you get that invitation to peer review a paper, consider taking it. And this is hard because in a lot of times service is not really valued that much for hiring and tenure decisions, and it's anonymous in many cases when you do peer review. And so for a lot of scholars who are oriented to like getting the big job or getting that promotion or whatever, they often discount service possibilities, but these service opportunities are important ways to shift the culture of academia. So if it's the case that the only people who take part in institutional review boards or peer review at journals or things like this are people who are really passionate about gatekeeping, you get this kind of pernicious negative effect. So even though a lot of this service work isn't compensated and doesn't add to your bylines or whatever on for the purposes of tenure and promotion. If more people who are concerned about censorship and self-censorship just really made it a point to do that kind of service work, it could help. And then last thing I'll say on it is like, it would also help if more scholars kind of refuse to let themselves be censored. So censorship works in part by making scholars feel really isolated and vulnerable and afraid. So to the extent that, when people are trying to intimidate you, you decline to be intimidated and proceed to publish your findings or say the things that you believe that are important and true. That creates social permission for other people to do the same thing. Whereas when you're silenced, when you're successfully silenced, when you're successfully terminated, that has the opposite effect. It encourages sends a signal to other people. So this is the thing, it's like censorship isn't just about censoring that individual, it's also about telling everyone else, this is out of bounds, you all need to shut up too, don't even think about opening your mouth, right? Yeah. So one thing that's important that can help kind of push things in the other direction is if people were less willing to be censored to the extent that they actually do have the ability to express themselves. And the nice thing now about some of the attempts to censor data and information in journals is that there are actually alternative ways that you can publish studies today. There are preprint things, there are a number of other ways to get your data out there, right? So I think scholars refusing to be censored can also help shift the culture a little bit.
I think related to that too is, not participating in the ostracism, and then also actually either defending or at least befriending the people going through this to show them that maybe there are social costs to publishing controversial conclusions. There are also a lot of benefits, and there's a huge group of scientists who will support you. And I think if people, oh, sorry, I got my emojis just popped up. If people would reach out to people going through this kind of, ostracism and shaming online and said, I have your back, we're still friends, I'm not going to ostracize you, that could be helpful too.
And how much of this relates to your stage of your career? I assume early emerging scholars are not like Steven Pinker.
Well, Musa and I have slightly different. Yeah, Musa, you go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm just started tenure track professor. This is my first year on the tenure track, and before this, I was a PhD student. And in fact, I'll give you a story. So when I was in my PhD program, I noticed that there was a bunch of studies done about Trump and Trump voters that had glaring errors and prejudicial study design, and there seemed to be this kind of systematic pattern in how social scientists study Trump and his supporters in ways that kind of distort what actually seemed to be happening. Okay, so I was talking to a professor about this, about how I was noticing this kind of systematic pattern, and I was, and he observed to me, oh yeah, I have a whole file drawer of these studies. They're happening all over the place. These kind of biased study design, glaring errors. I was like, oh, we should write a paper about this. And he was like, I will never do that, and you shouldn't either. But little did he know, I already had a paper sent out for review on this very topic, and it got published. It's called Race in the Race for the White House on Social Research in the Age of Trump. Wow. But this is a perfect example of this prosocial censorship. The reason he said I should never publish something like this is because I'm a PhD student. I'm an early career scholar, presumably wanting a tenure track job. And so he was giving me advice that he thought was the right advice for my career, and motivated by positive impulses. And to be honest, so I do a lot of work that's kind of challenging for prevailing views, but my own personal take on this was that is that if I can't be the scholar that I want to be, I would just rather not be a scholar, because I'm not a person who had only envisioned themselves as an academic Like if I didn't get an academic job, I'd just do something else with my life. But I understand that a lot of people don't feel the same way. But yeah, it's absolutely true that people who are more institutionally secure, so people at elite private institutions, prestigious institutions like Harvard or Columbia, people who are already tenured, are much less likely to be punished. So when you look at FIRE's data, I published an article in Reason talking about this. When you look at FIRE's data of who gets terminated when they get targeted for their research, people who are lecturers and adjunct faculty are fired about 50% of the time. They get targeted, they actually get fired. Tenure track faculty are fired less. Tenured faculty are fired rarely. And I've actually been canceled for my views before, incidentally, following a Fox News witch hunt, not a scientific censor's witch hunt. I actually lost an academic job that I held when I was an adjunct professor at University of Arizona. So I've experienced this, intimately. But again, you can make a choice not to allow yourself to be censored, and that's what I did in my case.
Wow. One quick question related to that. And Cory, I wanted to ask you if you had any personal experiences with this issue related to publication or the like. But I want to ask you both, you're both active still on X/Twitter. Where I persist. I keep track of the other platforms, but I haven't found them to be useful for what I do as a journalist, which is not just pushing stories out there. It's finding people to talk to and engage. Is social media, I've seen social media come to the aid of people in situations like yours, and I've seen it obviously work in the other direction. So let's talk about that first, and then Cory, I just want to hear from you on any particular examples. But does either of you feel that Twitter and the like are on average beneficial in overcoming this, or the opposite?
I think it's probably the opposite. And what I was going to say to the earlier question was, Musa and I have slightly different perspectives on like the function of tenure and things like that. So I have a paper that's under review where I surveyed psychology professors, and in that survey anyway, we see that tenured professors report self-censoring just as much as untenured professors, and they are also actually just as afraid of getting fired as untenured professors. And if anything, they're actually a little bit more afraid of other kinds of social sanctions, such as being called names on Twitter, and of being ostracized by their peers, of not getting invited to give, the fun talks and things like that. So what I suspect is going on is that tenured professors are they've invested their whole lives into this one career path, and there's really nowhere else for them to go. There's not another great career option for them. Whereas younger people, I have no job security whatsoever, but if I get booted from academia, I feel like pretty confident I'll figure something else out. I'm not all that worried about it. I don't really like academia that much, to be honest. So it's like, not a big loss. But if you're 65 and you've been doing this your whole life and you're like, I'm trying to retire in 5 years, you really don't want to lose all of your status and your community at that stage in your career. So even though tenure does provide some protections from actually getting fired, I don't think it protects people's careers in the way they would want to be protected, which is protecting their status and their esteem in their community.
Well, and there is actually a lot of research suggesting that in many cases, if people could choose between facing some kind of formal sanction versus being kind of socially ostracized, they would actually rather be formally sanctioned and stuff than socially ignored and isolated. And one of our co-authors on the paper, John McWhorter, talked about this a little bit. He in a talk he did for Heterodox Academy, he said, after he got, as he became more explicit in talking about race issues in ways that kind of cut against the preferred narratives of a lot of people who work on race issues, he stopped getting invited to things. So he used to get invited to a lot of talks, and then that stopped. and you don't get invited to parties the same way and things like this. And that's it sounds trivial, but it actually, it kind of sucks, especially if this is the place you want to be for the foreseeable future. Like, no one wants to be the person you walk into the faculty meeting and everyone's like, oh, before you even open your mouth. Or no one wants to enter a classroom and be met with like hostile people, or people who avoid taking your class in the first place, right? Because they, in fact, I'll give you one more story. I know a professor who is like, whose job is completely secure. They raise a lot of money. They're very prestigious. It's one of these kinds of, like, they would never fire this professor unless they shot someone on Fifth Avenue. But when the professor gave a talk in their class on, I think this was on sex differences in cognition or something like this, one of the students reported them, not because they said anything that was inappropriate. They were just summarizing the research. They faced no consequence because they didn't do anything wrong. They didn't face any formal sanction because they didn't do anything wrong. But the investigation itself, right, is a kind of consequence. It's really inconvenient and draining and anxiety-inducing. It puts a stink on you, even if you're eventually exonerated. And so the next time that the class came up, they modified the course a little bit, right? And so this is a kind of thing that, even though they weren't formally punished in this case, you can still see this censorship from people who aren't afraid of their job. And I guess this is the point. For people who aren't afraid of being terminated, they're not afraid of losing their jobs. You can still see significant censorship and self-censorship precisely because of these concerns about social dynamics and cultural concerns within the academy. So it's not enough to just fix the rules and policies. You also have to kind of address the culture.
Yeah, that cultural issue, it circles back to what I was saying earlier about campuses. By the way, many of these issues are in the media as well. Even within an individual newsroom covering a tough issue, there are cultural biases within the newsroom. I've been involved with stories for decades at the New York Times where reality, which was emerging from the data we were looking at on a terrible plane crash off Long Island, 1996, Flight 800. It was a bomb, a missile, or a mechanical failure, and everyone in the world was aligned toward it being terrorism. The reporters like me who are out on Long Island talking to the metallurgists at the FBI, there was nothing coming out of the water that said terrorism, but that dynamic was reverberating and our coverage got torqued in the wrong way. So that pattern and the culture issue, how do you create conversations where we listen to the outlier and look at the full sweep of the data is so important. I want to bring in Patrick Brown, who I mentioned to you earlier, is a climate scientist who has sort of lived this this issue recently. He's at the Breakthrough Institute, which itself often is fighting for respect, even though it's very data-based. It's an institution that looks at the role of innovation and policy in driving sustainability questions, whether it's conserving nature or slowing climate change. And Patrick is a climate scientist who has been in academia and is also at the Breakthrough Institute. And he made waves recently. And Patrick, could you just say hi and can you do a thumbnail sketch of, I know that's hard, of that moment when you decided to test for a prosocial bias in climate science literature?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to thank Cory and Musa for writing the paper along with everyone else, because I think that it overlaps a lot with a lot of the stuff I've been thinking about, and just a nice encapsulation of just a lot of research that I didn't realize was all out there. So I think it's a great paper and brings up a lot of really good points. What I did, I mean, it's similar. It's along these lines of soft censorship, really from peer reviewers in the field and editors and myself. informed from, by my experience in the field. But it was more along the lines of carrots as opposed to sticks, where I was talking about the kind of goal of publishing in high impact journals and just the knowledge of the field and what is the highest return on investment from a researcher's perspective to get a high impact publication. And so I had a paper published in Nature on wildfires in California. And I talked about how so after I published the paper in Nature, I wrote this essay in the Free Press. I left out the full truth to get my climate change paper published. And really what I'm referencing there is the decision to mold the research question in a nice, clean way to make the story very clean and to make the paper in what I thought would be the most palatable for Nature. So, wildfires are the result of many causal factors that are changing. And I chose to focus very narrowly on the climate angle, the climate influence on wildfires. And so I think that these types of framing decisions, there's nothing, all that's laid out and is honest in the paper itself. But in aggregate, what I worry about is a lot of people making the same types of framing decisions. And then I saw your figure 2 in your paper. That's exactly the type of thing that I'm thinking about, is that what's published in the research, or what comes out of the research canon overall, is not really representative of everything that's out there, that researchers can coalesce around the most fashionable research questions that they see are coming out of the high impact journals. And then that ends up giving a skewed view of reality overall.
And this is that, I'm showing that diagram, which again, I see this in journalism all the time, I have to say. If our narrative is centered on climate change, more and more media's funding is centered on climate change, meaning climate change in the climate from CO2, not just change in risk, meaning climate risk is driven by many factors: poverty, location, history, and then you add in CO2. And that bias, I think, that's why what Patrick tried resonated quite a bit with me as an observer of the science process, and as not just the science process, but that handoff, the dynamic from the funding, where the NSF says we want to study sea ice change from climate change, not just sea ice change, in the 21st century, to the result, to the abstract, to the news release, to the newsroom, and on into the public. And Patrick, you got hammered, I'd say, pretty aggressively by lots of folks for that. Some trying substantive ways, and some just trying to browbeat you. And you moved on and wrote another piece for the Breakthrough Journal. So now that where do you think this stands overall? Do you think you've helped to drive the same kind of question that the focus of this paper, or do you feel like it hasn't done what you thought it might do?
Well, I'm still trying. I do think that it's important to speak to that, the idea of ostracism and how that influences, the research questions that we ask. That I got to experience this in this juxtaposition, very rapidly back to back. That first I had my paper come out in Nature that's very much in line with the mainstream narrative of, climate change has this negative impact on wildfires, and the main knob that you can turn according to the results of our paper is basically how much emissions we have, right? So you can reduce danger by lowering emissions. So this is very in line with what other climate change papers, the way that they're framed. And so that comes out, and I have this very, very positive experience, right? I do over a dozen interviews with, very friendly journalists that are treating me like this is, this very interesting person with important things to say. And then I published the critique of my own paper and my own choices, and broadly of high impact journals and of the publishing landscape. And then that is a very, very different experience. That's a very negative experience, right? So yeah, a lot of very high profile people saying that I'm very wrong and very bad. And I knew, I don't want to play the victim here. Like, I knew that I wrote a very provocative thing and it was going to provoke a response. But I do, I felt that firsthand of like what it feels like to be ostracized by the highest people in your field. And I can totally understand why people wouldn't want to do that. It's like, why is it worth it, from a career perspective or just from a social perspective, to rock the boat too much when I don't have to do that? And so I think that affects the output of fields. And I got a lot of support privately, in my inbox and privately face-to-face, that was not represented publicly. But that's, again, evidence of the same type of self-censorship, that people don't want to support me publicly because then those high-profile accounts will come after them. So I think it's a problem.
So I'd love to hear some reactions here from Musa and Cory, and then Patrick, if you have questions for them. And by the way, if any of you can go past the turn of the hour, there might be enough here to keep going a little longer. But we'll get across that bridge when we come to it. Anyways, so Musa and Cory, any thoughts about how Patrick's experience relates? Obviously, you're not deeply dug in on it, so you don't have to worry about the details, but just the dynamic.
I don't know anything about climate science, so this is not a good topic for me. But it is actually interesting to me because not everyone on our co-author team is a behavioral scientist, but most of us are. But I've similarly heard people reaching out from different disciplines who feel the same kind of things happening in other areas of science, where there's this sort of pro-social concern about what narratives are best for society. So it's kind of interesting to hear your perspective on how this is happening in climate science as well. And something I've also suspected, because you'll hear sort of like overconfident claims about how climate change is to blame for a particular natural disaster, when I'm not sure how we would ever know for certain that anything like that could be attributed to that cause. But yeah, that's not really a question. It's just more, I find your story interesting as it relates to the paper. Yeah.
I think that it's, the questions that you raise are more obvious in social science, that there could be biases, from political leanings of academics, where I think it strikes people as less likely when they don't understand the type of climate science that I'm talking about, because it's closer to a physical science. And I'm really not talking about the hardcore physics, that is very well established and has been established since the 1800s. I'm talking about the prescriptions of how society should behave over the next century, which is what people will bring in and say, something like, the science says we have to limit temperature to a certain level or something. And that's literally, you're bringing in all of philosophy and ethics and trading off the well-being of different species and different peoples in different times across space and time. And so of course the science cannot tell us what to do on that. There's misperceptions.
Yeah, there's this great book by a sociologist at Columbia called named Gil Ayal, and the book is called The Crisis of Expertise. And his basic argument that I think is really relevant to this point is that as political decisions are increasingly hinge on science, on expert testimony, on scientific advice and guidance. So as politics has been increasingly scientized, science has become increasingly politicized, he argues. And there's this, there are a number of fields that are basically where experts are called to give advice and on matters that are basically trans-scientific. And so this is a term where he talks about where it's a question that can be framed in terms of framed and answered in ways that seem ostensibly scientific, but are also bound up with a lot of moral and political questions. So questions about acceptable risk, for instance, acceptable for whom, under what circumstance, etc. Like who's bearing the cost, who's doing the evaluation, all of these kinds of things are moral and political questions. They're not just empirical questions. And so on, when in a lot of these kind of trans-scientific matters, where you have moral and political stuff bound up with empirical questions, it can feel more important, especially when the stakes seem high, to suppress certain scientific findings or to tow particular narratives and things like this. And this is, as you noted, it's kind of more pronounced in some of our social research fields because the content of so what is politics? Politics is people hashing out how society should be arranged. What is social science? Well, it's people trying to analyze how society is arranged and what possibilities there might be and things like this, right? So the kind of overlap between what we do and moral and political questions is pretty close. But even for things like medicine, climate change, criminal justice is a social thing, but a lot of other issues, you kind of see these kind of trans-scientific questions that scholars are trying to weigh in on.
Oh boy. You've hit a vein for me. Gil Ayala was on my webcast two or more years ago because he was running a project for a year or so on climate science and trust. And I had Naomi Oreskes on and Mike Hume, who's a climate researcher in England. And they have very different attitudes on this. But it's crystal clear that that meshing that you just described, Musa, the sort of devolution of science into a policy tool and the perils that lie there came out pretty strongly. And I'm going to do something now. It's just a couple of minutes, but Mike Hume, this is the British scientist I mentioned, he wrote a book recently that focuses on what he calls climatism, which is the putting climate change in the foreground in all this descriptions of what's going on in the world. And he said something that's so relevant to this discussion today. So I hope you'll just quickly.
Well, a really interesting concept here of the noble lie, which I think goes way back to Plato and Socrates, and the idea that there are some untruths or some exaggerations that are appropriate for their social value. And I was looking back at the history of that thinking, and it was so interesting because there's a distinction between parables and noble lies, where with a parable, the person, the audience receiving the information kind of knows it's a story. But with a noble lie, it's actually a lie. And the intent is not for the person to know it. Maybe on some level they might know. So can you talk a little bit about this and what is the pull here?
Yeah, so I use this idea of the noble lie as a way to point to, I guess, the political operating space now that climate science operates in, and obviously this has become much more politically charged over the last 20 years or so. The issue here is really, what do we expect of science? What do we see science as a form of knowledge, in inquiry and production that is different and distinct, and it's got qualities that we recognize and value and treasure and need to defend, or actually are we simply seeing science as another political resource that can be mobilized in favor of any particular ideological position? And there's a long, not very pleasant tale here that we can go back into the history of certain areas of science where either explicit political ideologies have intervened, think Lysenko and genetics under Stalin's Soviet Russia, or think of the eugenics of the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, I'm not saying that the climate science is corrupt. I make that very clear. However, around the edges, there are definitely, in my view, examples where decisions have been taken or judgments have been made that have maybe for quite innocent reasons, and this is where the Nobel lie comes in the sake of a good cause. Shortcuts are taken, certain data or results might not be published that would normally be published. And I'm just sending a warning shot here against climate scientists and some of the communications around climate science, to say just be careful, because otherwise we risk demeaning science and its great public value if we think of it as no more than just another political resource that can be mobilized however which way we want it to be. So that's what I'm trying to get at here, and just offer a couple of warning shots that if we really value and treasure the power of science as a form of inquiry, we mustn't let it fall victim to the ideological politics of the contemporary moment.
That last line really resonates with me as I'm reading your paper. We can't let that functionality fall victim to a moment. So maybe Cory and Musa, if you want to offer some reflections, and then, we're getting toward the end here, but we could also do another session on this going forward with some of your colleagues, or digging deeper on that adversarial, overcoming adversarial barriers and the like. So does anything that Mike said there resonate? Also for you, Patrick, obviously, given your focus on climate.
Yeah, I think science, scientists can't stop people from using science for political reasons. So that's something that probably always has been and always will be part of science. The issue is, of course, how does that interfere with the scientific process itself? And this is one concern I've had, which is related to what everyone's been talking about here, is there are now some explicit calls for scientists themselves to be the ones to make these estimates about how is this going to impact society. And scientists are not particularly great at predicting the future. And not only that, but they have expertise in one specific little thing, which is their science. They don't know, how is the public going to react to this? How are politicians going to react to this? What's going to happen in 5, 10, 20 years, or what's going to happen to science itself if we try to manipulate the truth in this way. So I understand why people and why editors and journals are very concerned about the potential for science to cause great harm, because science is so powerful and people take it so seriously. But I don't think there's good reason to believe that scientists themselves are capable of making these trade-offs and making those decisions. So I don't know what you do about that. Maybe someone else has a better idea.
Musa, thoughts?
Yeah. So, what I think is really interesting about the noble lie framing is that, in the original story of the noble lie, the noble lie is something that you tell to arrange society as a whole. It's a noble lie that was for politicians and priests, basically in conjunction, told this noble lie to allow society to flourish in the right way. Okay. So the kind of work that politicians do when they engage in noble lies, so that to the extent that noble lies are advisable at all, they're advisable for political reasons. They're something that politicians would do, not scientists. Scientists are not supposed to be. As Cory said, there's a lot of research. Scientists are really bad at prediction. So Phil Tetlock, who works with Cory at Penn, has a whole book on this, on expert prediction. And he shows that in many respects, experts are actually worse than laymen at predicting, including and especially when they're predicting things in their area of expertise, and including and especially when they're driven by ideological motives. In fact, one of the more salacious, salty findings of the book is that in highly kind of ideological experts who are commenting on their areas of expertise were less accurate in making predictions than a dart throwing monkey. He had a monkey. He would ask a monkey, "Hey, what's going to happen with the price of gold or something like this?" and have the monkey throw a dart at random answers, and the monkey was more accurate, or equally was not less accurate than scientists making predictions about what was going to happen in their areas of expertise. And so, but there's this kind of misunderstanding that scientists have often, where they think they're going to that they know the best way to navigate some of these political questions. When you go to any faculty meeting, scientists are terrible at politics. They're terrible at social interaction. They're not like master manipulators. But we often think we do, and so we sometimes engage in behaviors that we think are going to generate a certain result, and we get the opposite result. I'll give an example. So one thing that climate scientists and other scientists have done for a long time was engage in what you could call climate catastrophism. So they would say, unless you do exactly what X, Y, and Z, we're all going to be dead in 5 years. Like really extreme, taking the most extreme projections and focusing on those as the likely projection, unless you do exactly what X, Y, and Z. Okay. The problem with this, and the thinking, I think, by a lot of people who engage in climate catastrophism, is that if you present these dire motives, it will spur people to act. It will get them to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. It will create states of exception where they'll endorse policies that are tough and all of this. Actually, when you look at the communication science and the cognitive and behavioral sciences, there's a lot of work that shows catastrophizing narratives cause people to disengage. Actually, it creates a kind of nihilism. They go, well, crap, I guess we're all dead. It's beyond my control, right? So it has the exact opposite effect of what people are hoping. And scientists who engage in these kind of catastrophizing narratives don't know this, of course, because they don't study communication science, which is they're coloring outside of their lane, right? And so it's really important for scientists to be a little bit more humble about what they actually know and what they're actually good at, and to not presume to know how to manipulate the public, how to navigate these kinds of thorny political and moral questions, thinking that they're, in virtue of having a PhD, somehow better at this than other people. One last example, and then is during the COVID-19 pandemic. For instance, in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, Fauci initially sent out basic messaging that went something like this, like masks might not work. Especially if you don't put your mask on correctly, it's actually worse than doing nothing, and things like this. So the CDC and Fauci in particular sent a lot of messages in the early stages of the pandemic discouraging people from masking. And it turned out that the reason he did this is because he was afraid of people making runs on stores and buying up all the masks in a way that would prevent first responders from being able to access the tools they need to keep people safe in hospitals and things like this. Okay, so it was a paradigm example of a noble lie. The problem was then later the CDC really wanted everyone to mask, especially as the data came in that seemed to suggest more strongly that COVID transmitted through the air. And a lot of people were skeptical, in part because they could point to Fauci's own comments about how masks don't work and how it's ill-advised and all of this kind of stuff. So this is a case where a politician where a scientist tried to engage in a kind of noble lie on a public policy question. And it had really adverse effects later with getting the public to do to follow their advice and defer their advice. And I talk about this in a Guardian column that I wrote but there's many more examples. The COVID-19 pandemic is rich with examples because so much was at stake and science was so central to a lot of the kind of political and policy questions at that time. But yeah, scientists would be ill-advised to engage in noble lies because they're really bad at prediction and they're really bad at communication in many cases, and they really are bad at gauging what the effects will actually be of the kind of manipulations they're attempting to do.
That's quite a combo. Patrick, any last thoughts on this? Reflecting on where we go from here, particularly.
Yeah, just a couple things on the noble lie, and I'm not saying you were saying this, but I get really uncomfortable. I've heard this a lot of when people say, "Oh, catastrophism doesn't work," where we're basically saying that our goal is to move society in one direction or another, and so this strategy that we came up with of catastrophism doesn't work. So we should try another strategy. Like that is forfeiting what I think climate science should be, which is just a much more pure, truth-seeking exercise. As far as noble lies and climate science, I don't see a ton of that. I've definitely seen explicit admission of that, but I do think it's much more just different evidentiary standards for different conclusions. So more subtle than the explicit, I'm going to say something that I know is not quite true because I think that it will do something. I just saw something in one of these big assessment reports. Andy had the graphic up of the RCP 8.5, and it was it's a projection of floods under RCP 8.5 emissions, which are implausible on their own, but then it's no increase in flood protection. So it's this idea that we would have way more. We're using way more energy, and we don't use any of that for increased flood protection. And then we're going to calculate how many more people are exposed to floods and then use that. That's the type of thing I don't actually think people really realize what they're doing. It's more just that their mental faculties are not operating in a skeptical mode where they would be if it was a result that they didn't like. So in order to solve it, I'm not sure, but I do like some of the suggestions from your paper. I like the embrace of audits of journals, and the idea that journals, that we could actually look at the same methodology and different results and whether or not they're treated differently. I mean, I think this strikes me as the most direct scientific way to study this.
Cory, do you want to say one last thing on that point?
Actually, yeah, just because I've had a couple of people reach out to me about that idea specifically since the paper came out. And people keep saying, oh, the IRB would never approve such a thing. We would never be able to do it. Journals would never consent to this kind of thing. And I just would like to push back if that's true and you're an IRB person or someone who would consider pursuing this topic, or you're a person who has power over a professional society or a journal. The scholars do these audits of organizations all the time. They lie to employers to test for racial biases and gender biases, and they waste the time of these people without their consent. And if scientists can do this to other people, then scientists should let scientists do it to other scientists. Like, it's not that big of a deal, especially when it's so important to what it is we're actually trying to accomplish, which is presumably to report the truth and good information. So just a pitch for being open to that idea if you have any control over that happening.
Well, that would be a good follow-up thing to dig in on here. I want to show something that I found useful. This gets at the prosocial peril. Ken Caldera, who's a climate scientist, I'm sure he knows Patrick very well, and vice versa. He apparently was an undergrad philosophy major, and he's the one who pulled my head over to David Hume from centuries ago, who said, you talked about the is-ought issue. Science is mostly the is or the maybe, the probabilistic is. And society is all about oughts. What do you do? And Ken, in talking to a lot of scientists over the years about how do you handle this business of being prosocial as a human being, but wanting to keep your science robust and respectable, I came up with what I call the 2-sentence rule. At the very least, say, I'm a glaciologist. I study Antarctica. The ice sheet is diminishing rapidly. This is how it might affect sea level and affect your city. I'm also a parent, or I'm a voter, and I'm never going to vote for Trump because I think he's very dangerous. So at least you're doing that conscious delineation of the pro-social human and the pro-knowledge science. I don't know if these little practices, I think, might have some incremental effect if they were propagated. But
I think this is great. I haven't seen this before, but it overlaps with something Roger Pilkey has talked about. He's used the phrase stealth advocacy, where scientists use their position as a scientist to essentially pretend that their opinions are facts. So the stealth part is is to say, this is my recommendation for the world, and this is just coming from pure reason and logic because I am a
Right.
scientist. And I think it's really
And
important.
because scientists are so good at prediction, right?
Trust the science, trust the science.
And Max Weber had a similar point where he argued, scientists are citizens as well, right? And we have obligations as citizens. We have responsibilities as citizens to take part in a lot of kind of cultural and moral questions beyond the science. But it's important, as you said, to delineate when we're speaking as citizens, as parents, as whatever, versus when we're speaking as scientists and researchers and academics and representatives of institutions.
Well, I thank you all for being here today. I wanted to show one last slide because it was really pertinent. So anyway, thanks for the paper. And I think the more we discuss this issue and the more your paper generates some of these specific actionable ideas, like what you were talking about with how to pursue the research, the better off we'll all be. And I noticed this. There's an artist, a cartoonist on Facebook, Pedronix, who did this a few years ago. Which, 19th century science had its own problems, but I think he's getting at this same dynamic we're all talking about here, which is 21st century scientist. There's a funny typo there. I must get the result that fits my narrative so I can get my paper into Nature, as opposed to I'm here to figure out how the world works. That's the dynamic I think you're really working hard to try to preserve, at least from my standpoint as a journalist looking at all this. So thanks, Musa, al-Gharbi, Cory Clark, and Patrick Brown for coming together in this pop-up opportunity called Sustain What. And again, we can collaborate on doing it again and looking deeper at any one of these questions. Wherever, for those who are watching now or whoever stumbles on this later, you can share it. It's on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and X, Twitter. And the scrolling bar at the bottom tells you how to get in touch with further ideas. And again, thank you so much for the work you're doing, and good luck with the next steps.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And hold on.